There are few topics that ever enter our mind that are more difficult and more of a challenge in a family situation than the suicide of someone that we dearly love. I don't think there's ever been a time in talking with family that it's been harder to find the right kind of words and to be of encouragement to them in any way than when someone they dearly love has killed themselves. Probably because of the suicide of Rick Warren's son. This is much more on our mind today. And in that situation where the son had struggled with mental illness of different sorts, you almost have the epitome of what goes on in the death of someone that has killed themselves. All kinds of questions enter into our mind. The Bible talks about different ones committing suicide. It tells about King Saul killing himself. And it tells about Judas, probably the most well-known of all the cases of suicide. It's interesting to me that when Peter discusses the suicide of Judas, he doesn't say that he was lost because he had killed himself. Instead, he talks about him going to his own place, but it was because he had allowed Satan to take over, and he had denied the Lord and had betrayed him. And so his suicide was not the problem that had led to his being condemned. I've heard people say that when someone commits suicide that they're violating the command, you'll not commit murder. But murder was never that kind of thing. Suicide in every case I've ever been involved with in talking to families or even with someone who had attempted suicide and had been unsuccessful, it seems to always be tied in some way to mental illness and despair, where someone has gotten so far down and has given up on life that they try to take their own lives many times. In looking back, if it did not succeed, people will talk about how sorry they are and how that they don't know how that even came about in their life. God never holds people accountable for actions that were done when they were not mentally at themselves. And so we need to be careful in our thinking and in our talking about matters of suicide, especially in dealing with the family. There's a passage over in Hebrews chapter 6 that I think is significant on this particular matter. Paul had been describing for the church how they needed to grow up, that they had not developed in their spiritual life in depth the way they should have. And then he comes down after all of that discussion in verse number 7 and says to them, "Brethren, I'm persuaded better things of you, and things that accompany salvation." And then the next verse says, "For God is not unjust to forget about your labor of love and how you have helped those that were weak and struggling." The writer will go on and talk about the things that are characteristic in their life and in their faith and devotion to God. But here's the statement I want you to think about. God is not unjust to forget. See, when we stand before the judgment bar of God, we aren't judged just on the last thing that happened in our life. Judgment isn't about a single event. It's about a lifetime. It's about what we've done. It's about the tenor and the nature of our life. God is not unjust. If someone has lived a life of faith and devotion to God, But in the last days and moments of their life when they are mentally distressed and things aren't coming together in their mind the way they ought to, and in that despair, they take their own life. They aren't judged just about that event. God is not unjust. He is a gracious and loving and caring God who understands. It's just the reality that we ought to understand that so often suicide is tied to mental illness. And even in this country, we don't hold people guilty of crimes that they've committed when they weren't thinking right, when their mind was not right, when they were off in some way. Think about a small child that somehow gets a hold of his dad's gun and shoots and kills a little brother or sister. We don't hold that child responsible for that action when they didn't realize, didn't know what they were doing, had no idea. Most of the time, if you've ever been involved in talking with a family in that situation, that child is still expecting that brother or sister to come back. They have no idea what they've done. I would hope that all of us would learn in times of such distress not to add to the distress of the family that's already hurting as badly as they can, but to be the compassionate, caring, and loving people that our Lord would have us to be in such times.